when Beckett Cook talks about how like poorly done the movie is and the narrative arc's like missing, I love that because you're like, what? You completely missed that? Like you didn't see any of what we
Yeah.
the world.
I know.
It's like it's like he's looking at it as if it was Christian propaganda, like how they would make it. It's like there's no definitive point they're trying to make here. It's just people's stories. Like they didn't edit them, doctor them. They didn't use them for anything.
Yeah.
This is garbage.
Where's the exploitation here for the narrative?
Right. Hello and welcome to another episode of Growing Up Christian. I'm Casey, and unfortunately Sam couldn't join me tonight, so just me here. We just didn't quite get an intro together for this episode. I ducked out for the weekend to Kansas City for my wife's. Her birthday's coming up, so we went up for the weekend to Kansas City and just hung out and, lost track of time a little bit. But if I could plug something that we did this weekend that I thought was incredible. If you listen to a few of the episodes, it's like every 3 episodes, I have to talk about my love for Dan Carlin. And if you've ever listened to Hardcore History, then you know what I'm talking about. He's just a fantastic guy, fantastic podcaster. And so one of the things we did when we were up in Kansas City this weekend was we went to I think it's the National World War I Monument and Museum. And it's right downtown. It's this big, beautiful, ornate building that was built. I think the first round of it was built in the 20s after World War I. It's an incredible place. Crazy collection of stuff. And they partnered with Dan Carlin to do this. It's like a VR experience that's all based around World War I, where his goal was kind of to put you in the trenches with the guys that were fighting in the Great War. And it takes you to a couple of different locations, but they've got this set up in this upper room in the upper part of the museum, and that you put on the goggles and the headphones, and snap of a fingers, boom, you're like riding in a Zeppelin high above Europe, and there's an air raid going on, and there's wind blowing in your face, and it was awesome. It's incredible. It's a one-person thing, so like if you go, we both did it, but you kind of do it on your own and walk through. But really cool. I just feel like people need to hear about this. If you haven't gotten to do something like that and you're anywhere near Kansas City, you should go check it out. I thought it was absolutely amazing. But yeah, so we ended up, we were in the trenches rather than recording an intro. So this week we're going to have a short one. Let me introduce our guest this week. And if you've been around Growing Up Christian for a little while, you'll know this name right off the bat. Our guest this week is Lucas Wilson, or Luke Slam Dunk Wilson, if you follow him on Instagram. And he's a friend of the show. I think at this point, we're just going to go ahead and say he's an honorary co-host of Growing Up Christian. Fantastic guy, gay rights activist, has done a lot to speak up against some of the malpractices involved in gay conversion therapy, or quote unquote reparative therapy. And he talked to us several months ago about his experience at Liberty University going through conversion therapy and some of the things that came about as a result of that. Since then, he's done all sorts of cool stuff. He's been on some fantastic podcasts like Fundy Friday and a bunch of different other ones, Straight White American Jesus. And I don't know, just we love Luke. He's the best. And if you haven't listened to his first episode with us, you may want to go check that out. He's joining us today to talk about this Netflix documentary that just came out. It's been making a lot of waves. It's called Pray Away, and it's about sort of the history of the gay conversion therapy movement and some of the leadership within the, kind of the main organization behind it years ago called Exodus. And a lot of these leaders, started out They were really believed in the cause, and they did a lot to lobby for conversion therapy and stuff, and slowly just came to the realization that it was really harmful, that it was hurting people and hurting themselves, and ended up leaving that movement. And some of them left Christianity altogether. But it's a really fantastic documentary. A lot of people have talked about it. Our focus in this episode centers around an article that was written in response to Pray Away. I think it was the Gospel Coalition. I forget the author, but we'll talk about it here in a few minutes. But he wrote an article kind of skewering the documentary for a whole host of reasons. At the central impetus of his article, though, is that this documentary is very anti-Christian, and it's just the typical Hollywood liberals, out to smear Christianity and traditional family values, blah, 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 persecution complex nonsense. But we kind of walk through his article paragraph by paragraph with Luke and sort of pick apart some of the arguments and stuff that he made, and just kind of all around roast the dude. It's a really bad article. If you haven't read it, go check that out, because I think that'll give you a little more context for this. Even if you haven't gotten to watch Pray Away yet, it's worth going and just taking a look at this article so you can see where we're coming from. Gospel Coalition, you're welcome for the free advertising. So anyways, we go through that and talk a lot about some of the things that the statements that he makes, and again, pick them apart. And it's just an all around fun discussion with, again, Luke Wilson, one of our favorite people. Before we jump into the episode, just as always, if you haven't joined our Discord yet, you should definitely do it. It's a fun place, and I feel like we're getting more and more momentum in there. Good group of people. You can find the link in any of our social media. We're even looking at doing some special things within the Discord. Like, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, we put out a call for people who were who had stories about their experience growing up in Christianity, and particular things that happened to them that they felt were unique or impactful, harmful or good. But basically, we're looking at putting together sort of a listener story episode, and it's all going to be kind of centered around people within the Discord. So we've gotten some really good replies, and we're looking forward to putting that together. But that's some of the stuff that we do over there. And if you're not in there yet and you feel like you've got a great story for us, join the Discord, message either Sam or myself. We'll be happy to talk to you about it. As always, we've gotten a lot of new listeners, I think, over the past couple of weeks here, thanks to our buddy Christian Nightmares and some of the other cool people that have helped put the word out about the show. If you're new to the show and you're enjoying it, we would appreciate it if you'd share it with a friend or a family member, preferably not someone who's going to kick you out of Thanksgiving dinner or anything like that, but somebody who you think might enjoy it, or comes from the same perspective, I guess. Also, if you like the show, we would really appreciate it if you'd stop over at iTunes and give us a review. Thanks to everybody who's left us a review. We do appreciate it. So, with all that out of the way, sit back, relax, and enjoy our discussion with Luke Wilson.
Hey everyone, we are back with our friend Luke Slam Piece Wilson. Is that the moniker? No, Slam Dunk Wilson. What's your,
Wilson.
Okay, you should change it to Slam Piece Wilson. Is that fair to say?
You're not the first person to recommend that, Sam.
Ah, darn it! I thought it was being
No, you're
funny.
on something, I think.
My term of endearment for you is the gay agenda.
That is
We're coming after him hard.
Yeah. What are you trying to say here, Casey?
Hey, I'm all for the gay agenda.
Yeah.
We want equality. Shut up, you queers.
Yeah, that's the gay. That's what's so funny about the gay agenda. It's like, not a lot of introspection going on there, right? When they're all like they don't have an agenda. Like, the gay agenda is literally just, can you leave us alone? It's not much of an agenda, but it's really offensive to, to a certain group of people, I guess.
The desire to be treated like human beings. It's a lot to ask for. A lot to ask for.
All right, man. So we, for everyone, I don't know who's seen it by now. I feel like a lot of people have. We're probably a little late to the game and even talking about it. I know, Luke, you've had a couple of conversations about it, but we are going to talk about the Netflix documentary Pray Away. That seemed to make some waves in the world, especially the evangelical world. They had some things to say about it, but particularly we're also going to touch on a pretty interesting hit piece from the gospel. I'll have to find the author's name of the article. You might even know it off the top of your head.
Beckett Cook.
Okay, Beckett Cook. He wrote a ridiculous piece for the Gospel Coalition. It's dumb.
But I feel like that's pretty par for the course for the Gospel Coalition, right? That which comes out of that publication is like pure chaos always.
Yeah, it really is. I remember even in my more evangelical days. So I had got a Twitter 8 years ago and did nothing with it. I ended up deleting it, but they were one of those pages that I followed because I didn't know anything about them. I just knew like some of my friends followed them, and I just guessed they were fine. And at that point in my life, I hadn't even changed that much at the time. And I remember reading some of their articles being like, oh, this is a lot. These are interesting takes.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, they're really pushing the Christianity is under attack.
Yeah,
sort of mentality.
We're victims.
Yeah. So the film Pray Away, I mean, I'm sure most people know, but it's basically, not basically, it is a documentary on Exodus International, which was the gay conversion therapy program that a lot of churches hitched their horse to. Hitched their horse to? I don't know if that's hitch their wagon to that horse. Sure. I don't know. Hitching things to horses and stuff like that. I also, when I was on vacation last week, I was driving through Pennsylvania. We took some back roads to avoid some traffic, and we passed a lot of horse and buggies. That's the first time I'd ever seen that. So that was cool.
How's the puppy now?
Ooh, the puppy. Yes. Very, very good. She's very resistant to peeing outside. For anyone who hasn't paid attention, I got a puppy on my way back from North Carolina last week. But yeah, she is like, she holds it and you take her out. You'll sit outside for like 45 minutes and she'll, the second you bring her in and put her down, she pees all over the floor. You're like,
it's a fine.
Man, so I watched this in the past week here, and I'm interested. So one of the things that I was going to ask you about is it seems like some of the response to Pray Away, and maybe I'm getting ahead of things, but some of the response to Pray Away is like changing the narrative of what reparative therapy is trying to do. Because the documentary centers around an organization, that Exodus International, and it seemed to me like the main thrust of their message was, through Christ you can be rid of your sexual temptation, right? You're going to find your straighthood through worshiping Jesus. But it seems like part of the response to the documentary is to sort of flip that on its head and say, no, of course you can't pray the gay away. Of course you'll never be rid completely of your temptations. You're just learning how to deny your sinful nature. Is that like a shift? Because I've always thought of it as the former scenario. Well,
it's a both and. So I mean, initially, as you see with Exodus International, they claimed that one could change one's attractions, whether that had been to one woman or to all women. It doesn't matter, because ultimately, if God can create the earth, God can change orientations. And so this was the lie that was peddled, which of course Exodus, as the documentary shows, demonstrated, of course, that you can't. Like newsflash, obviously everyone else knew, but they were a little bit late to the game. And so they eventually denounced that teaching. What is now again, as you see with the Beckett Cook, the Gospel Coalition article, what you see there is that he, like you're saying, he says, I left my gay identity. And notice the language. He's not saying I left like my gay attractions. It's the gay identity. And then he says, I also, at another point that says,
Yeah.
in the article, he says, I left my gay life. He actually doesn't use lifestyle, which I think is an intriguing choice, which I could get back to later. But this idea of a life, because I think that he knows that there's no such thing as the gay lifestyle. Like, gays are just as boring as everyone else. Like, what does it mean to have a gay lifestyle? But this idea of like gay life is, again, I think this is pointing to his understanding of sexuality, which is like Exodus's, based on action. So if I don't have a gay life, I'm not doing anything that's gay, i.e. like, touching men or whatever us gays do. If you're not doing that, you're not living the gay life. You're not living in that gay identity. You're living outside of that. But the funny thing is that you never see Beckett Cook in this article say what he's doing otherwise. He just says that he doesn't have that identity. That he's a new creation in Christ, right? Like, it's a lot of, these, not even verbal gymnastics, because he's not really, well, maybe it is verbal gymnastic in the sense that he's skirting around. It's like, okay, Beckett Cook, what exactly is the remedy here? How does one live an ex-gay life as you're doing, apparently? And he's apparently doing really well. I'd love to know Beckett Cook's internet history. But this idea of him changing, it's like, I'm so curious what he is proposing. And this is what I think is actually the case, is that conversion therapy programs, conversion therapy teaching, even though it's acknowledging or has acknowledged that conversion therapy doesn't work, and that one can't just like change one's orientation, there still is this belief that's inherent within a lot of these programs and whatever ministries or paraministries or whatever you want to call them, that they do believe that and they do peddle that. However, they're not going to publicly say it. And I think this is what a lot of the attention on conversion therapy has done, has pushed these organizations down. And they're gone underground, right? They're no longer on their websites claiming that anyone can actually change in this sense or the way that they used to, as seen in Exodus or in Pray Away, by Exodus. But what they're doing is that they're saying, no, it's different. Like, we're just saying we want to support you. And there are people like what's that genius's name? Karen Pryor from Liberty, right? This woman who signed the Nashville Statement. She talks about, the Nashville Statement was the Southern Baptist Association, I believe, that said, again, we reaffirm our homophobia. It's like, we knew, like, didn't have to repeat that, but okay. And she's one of the signers that's, saying this is
just so we're clear,
in case anyone was wondering. And so, but Karen Pryor's caught on film saying, she's in an interview, I shouldn't say caught on film, like she willfully did this. She talks about how she's like there to like be alongside and walk alongside the side of people who are quote unquote struggling with same sex attraction. Again, no specifics are detailed. No one knows what it means to walk alongside or to support or to, not live the gay life or, not have the gay identity. But okay, so what's the alternative? Again, I think that what happens is that they say all this and it means nothing. And what they're really saying behind closed doors is that you really can change. And that's what you see with a lot of people who are coming out of these ministries as of recent.
Yeah. It's like you think about I think of everything in terms of like sales pitches, and the sales pitch that you're going to be like eternally plagued by these desires that you can never act upon is a tough sell. That's pretty hard to work out. Yeah. So I think it's always going to be an underlying part of it. Cause I mean, that's much easier as like, hey, this part of you that has maybe upset your family or your community or something like that you maybe, have some self-loathing over, like you can be rid of that. That's way easier to pitch to people. It's almost like prosperity gospel type level stuff where it's, sure. It's not that, hey, we're going to teach you to be a good steward of whatever God gives you, which may not be much of anything. It's if you're following God, God is going to bless you, and that's going to result in better financial situations.
Yeah. And I think that you see a decrease in the number of people who are actively pursuing these quote unquote ministries, because it's like, as like gender and women's studies have taught us over the past few years, which is, of course, like it's within the realm of the university. Well, certain universities, not Liberty University or others like it. But, you'll find that a lot of these schools are talking about this. Judith Butler, who's reading Judith Butler, a lot of people in the academy, which then trickles down to like the idea that gender is a performance. We see RuPaul, we see these ideas trickle down to like the mainstream. And here in 2021, these ideas are now in a lot of ways mainstream, and they're popularized, and a lot of people, talk about these topics now, and a lot of people who are social influencers or whatnot are also talking about these things, which is freaking phenomenal. And so I think that there's this greater literacy in sexuality and gender that we see today. And we also see, just again, a greater acceptance of the queer community. And so I think these things in tandem are pushing against the popularity of programs like Exodus. And I think there's also a mass, to use the word, exodus from the evangelical church, right? There are so many people that are leaving, all these ex-evangelicals who are either finding a new religious tradition, whether it be within Christianity or without, or just giving up on religion altogether. And I think because of these shifts in the culture in whatever North American and Canadian American society, if we can talk about these specifically, we can see that there's less of an interest in these ministries. So there are a few people going. And so, yeah, I think it is less of an appealing like PR to say like, hey, we'll support you, but not really tell you what that is until you get inside the doors. But then once you're in there, again, I think that this is a narrative that is appealing, regardless of whether or not it was masked initially or not. But the good news is that there are more and more people leaving these sorts of organizations and churches altogether. So there's, I think, and this is again not based on any research or any stats, that there are fewer and fewer numbers that are, again, flocking to these sorts of groups.
Yeah, they seem to be thinning out, definitely. And I mean, as the evangelical church thins out, those evangelical organizations are going to start losing numbers for sure. Maybe a little bit slower, because typically the people who are in those are the ones who are less likely to leave, as they're more the double downers at this point. One of the things that I think is we've seen, and this is Casey and I's own experience, and I think countless others, is when we grew up in the evangelical bubble, I remember being taught about and learning about Exodus International as a kid. And I remember getting in debates with my non-Christian friends about how gay people could change, and that because, you've been told your entire life that Christ has the power to do anything and that he can change your life. And the irony of that message being spouted by a 13-year-old is, what does that even look like? When you talk about the gay lifestyle and what that looks like, I would have argued at that point in my life that I was transformed by Christ, but what the fuck does that even look like when you're 13 years old? And I mean, you masturbate every time you get a chance. Anytime a
ceremonially carry your Bible to school.
Yeah,
Always.
Exactly. That's one of the big things. It's like, I'll bring my Bible to a sleepover. And you're like, oh boy.
Yeah, the cover of my Bible literally was torn off because of how many times I brought it with me to school. Every day.
Man,
I was like, God,
doing good work.
An opportunity to talk to someone about my Bible when they see me reading my Bible. And oftentimes they did. They were like, what the hell are you reading? And I was like, my Bible. They're like, what? So but I don't know if it was God doing it.
Well, that's way to not hide it under a bushel.
You know what?
Proud of you, Luke.
Hey, thanks, guys. And Sam, I think a further irony in all of this was that you're talking about how when you were, a 13-year-old kid talking to your friends about how it's possible to change. By the time I was, 14, 15, 16, I was also having that conversation, and I was the one, professing this. And of course, I was a little queer kid, and people probably were looking at me like, what is wrong with this guy? Yeah, a lot, I suppose.
What's even crazy? I want to go back to, I want to stay on this gay identity conversation for a bit. I know you said we could go back to it, but we're on it. So let's just hang out here for a second, because with what he says in the article about leaving his identity, and that is the shift. And like Casey was saying, what he's pushing back on is that it's not about whether or not, because there was that shift, it's not about whether or not you're attracted to men anymore. It's just about whether or not you're living a particular lifestyle and if you're doing the right things because Christ changed you. So it's hard to argue he doesn't want to. He doesn't really touch on desires so much as just, outcome and performance. So I think that's interesting also because they would be the first to argue that the gospel is about a changed heart and not about performance or anything like that. So I think, that's a kind of a chicken and egg thing right there. But when you're talking about the gay identity, like what I heard a lot of, and what I think he's doing in this article is saying, like, when you say I found my identity in Christ, that feels so frustrating because they don't have conversations really about identity, maybe in passing, but not really about anything else. The only time I ever really heard these things outside of like a youth group, like your identity should be in Christ, not in your band t-shirts, like bullshit like that. It was you do find your identity in that. I mean, Christians find their identity in their republicanism, or they're even Democrats, like progressive Christians will find it. Like, I don't care who you are. Like, you really are grafting towards social identities, because that's what humans do. And there's really no way around that. And you can pretend that you can avoid that through the power of Christ. But then you go and look in these places, and all they're doing is like succumbing to whatever general identities are convenient, whether it's for, fitting in socially, or even pushing back on certain things. Maybe you'll have someone who's slightly more progressive in evangelical church, and they like to be the ruffle the feathers kind of guy. Like, but identity is really, we just call those personality traits, right? Oh, that's just who I am. That's just my personality. But when it comes to homosexuality, it's like, oh, nope, can't be that. And then now we have to parse that out and say that can't be your identity. And I think that's disingenuous.
I think it raises a question that I think you're right. It's greater than just this film and looking at sexuality. It's this idea of what are categories that constitute authentic identity, and what are categories that don't constitute authentic identity. And those that would be authentic would include Christian, American. They do have a very distinct emphasis on gender as well, right? Being a man or being a woman, whatever that means, according to them. And so they have these very, concrete understandings, or like very, pre-thought out understandings of what it means to be an American Christian, a man, a woman, whatever. But there are certain categories that are taboo or erased, right? So the reason I say taboo or erased is not because, that all of them are taboo. The idea of race is certainly taboo, right? Like they would not say that, oh, I find any identity in me being white or you being black. Again, this like really strong resistance against critical race theory. They're terrified of it, but they don't even actually know what it is.
Yeah, right.
But that's one thing that they definitely are resistant against, and say like this is not authentic. But one category that is both not a category, but also an invisible category or erased category is sexuality, because they'll say that it's not okay to identify. And they in the article in Beckett Cook's article, is it Beckett Cook or right? It's Beckett Cook.
Yep.
Beckett Cook. In Beckett Cook's article, he says you can't find identity in your sexuality, but then in the same breath, of course, they're presupposing that proper identity is in your heterosexuality. And so people do find, identity in that, in getting married and having sex with their, naturally born man and naturally born, woman, wife or husband. Right. And so it's like that's a category that's erased.
Right. Yeah.
Like, oh, I find identity in that. That's just sort of this, like, exactly like you said, it's just who I am. It's just part of what makes me me, but they wouldn't say that's part of their identity. But again, if you are to ever identify with your sexuality and you're part of the queer community, well, that's craziness. That's ludicrous. And like, why would you even do that? So I think that there is this weird understanding of identity and how it's deployed and used as, ways to control.
Yeah.
And also how to to understand themselves.
And I think so. To jump off that, because you mentioned gender too, and one of the things that he says. So to add some context for people who haven't seen it, if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth watching. I understand. I have seen some people talk about how it was mostly from the LGBTQ community, of course, that it's a difficult thing for them to watch, or that they couldn't get through it. So if that's your lived experience, you probably don't really need to watch it to have any fucking clue what we're talking about. But if you're straight, if you grew up evangelical, you should watch it. I mean, I think it's an important film. But to set the context, it starts off with the film opens with a guy named Jeffrey. I think it's McCall, something like that. And he's like, he said he was a former transsexual, and he left all that. Now he's like on the street asking people if he can pray for them, kind of trying to lead an ex-gay movement. And what the author of the Gospel Coalition article says, Beckett, I'm going to just read this little quote here, because I think it touches to what you were saying about finding your identity and your gender subconsciously. I think this is a subconscious issue. And he says, the film opens on Jeffrey McCall, a former transsexual who had a powerful encounter with God and is now transformed by the gospel. And he's saying that seriously. Like, he's like, this to follow in the article is his frustration with it in what appears for the filmmaker to be kind of making fun of or not taking seriously his gospel transformation. But so then he goes on to say, the camera follows him on the streets of Georgia, offering prayer to strangers. It's clear the director capitalized on McCall's lilting and effeminate Southern accent in an attempt to discredit him. And that's not what's going on there at all.
I also think the fact that he's gay and trans is what discredits him as an ex-gay. I think that's actually more so this idea of, he's like trying to capitalize on this. It's like an attempt to discredit him. No, what discredits him is that he's gay, is that he's trans, and he's saying he's not. That's what discredits him.
Yeah, they picked him because I don't know if I'm like, I don't want to speak out of turn, but it's like, he's very clearly like, it's so obvious. Like, that he's gay.
He clearly identified, like he says, like, this is how I identified, and the only reason that he's no longer identifying that is because it's new life in Christ. So if we're following that logic, we obviously know that nothing's changed, right? And so what we can say here is that a man who obviously, and I don't think he would say that he doesn't find men attractive. I think he would say that. And so I think it's this idea like the film's trying to discredit him. No. It's the fact that he's gay and trans, and yet he identifies as an ex-gay. That's the claim there, which of course contradicts his lived reality, is what discredits him, right? Like,
right,
plain and simple.
And Beckett discredits him. That's what I find so wild, is Beckett's discrediting of him in a totally different. Like, the film's just trying to show you who this guy is. And I mean, if that's Beckett's judgment call on what the film's showing, that shows some pretty clear. I don't know if the right word is homophobia. I'm not sure.
There's a definite that. Like, when I read that sentence and the one that follows, just to repeat, it says, it's clear the director capitalized on McCall's lilting and effeminate Southern accent in an attempt to discredit him. Oh, those Bible Belt rubes and their quaint coming to Christ stories. It's like he's dismissing McCall as like an adequate representation of their movement.
Because of his understanding of masculinity.
Talks. Yeah, because of the way he talks and like his mannerisms. Like, you still don't meet, with everything you're doing, Mr. McCall, and all of the, your Freedom March and the stuff that you're doing in this documentary, like, you still don't make the cut, according to Beckett. Like, you're still not adequate. You're not straight enough or delivered enough because of the way you talk.
Yeah.
And I think it's like this idea, like he says, those quaint coming to Christ stories. It's like, it's this constant attack on Christianity, that Christians are constantly the victims. They're, he says even at one point, they bold it and make it into a special section in the article. It says, mischaracterizing the Christian life as a favorite pastime of Hollywood, as I know from experience. It's like, we get it. You worked in Hollywood, but like, really the question is, what did you do? Because your analysis of this film is pretty poor. We'll get to that later. But it's like, I just love it that it's constantly like mischaracterizing the Christian life. No, like, this is documentary footage. Of course, every documentary has a perspective, an angle, a lens, whatever. But like, they're literally quoting and showing quotes of these folks saying the things that they do.
I do think it is funny how like in Christians, I suppose a lot of organizations and people do it, but there's just like this constant theme in Christian culture where they take someone who apparently self-professes to have like a past experience with another religion or an industry or, in this case, like sexual identity and stuff like that. And we never really get a clear explanation of like what their experience was or how long they were there or what. It's just like, this person was a part of it. That's how we know they're credible for that reason. Like it always reminds me of Ergen Cantor, who we've talked about before. He was the president of the seminary at Liberty when Sam and I were students there. And his claim to fame was that he had grown up in Turkey as a quote unquote radical Muslim and had like a conversion experience, was transformed by Christ, and it led him to the gospel, and he ended up being a pastor and stuff. And it later came out that none of it was true. His whole backstory was concocted for the purpose of like building legitimacy behind him as a speaker and stuff. And I don't know, it is funny. It's just like, what exactly was your experience in Hollywood? Like, what did you do? How long were you there? why are you an expert on Hollywood and everyone there and what they're constantly trying to do? Because I'm pretty sure they'll do whatever makes money.
He literally just worked at the Burger King in Hollywood. Like, it was in Hollywood. And he's like, I was there for a decade. Wait a second.
Who knows? Maybe he was at some Bryan Singer parties. Hopefully not. Hopefully not. You muted, dummy.
Okay, cool. Great. I had to mute because the water was flooding down my pipes, and I apparently didn't unmute. Luckily, I hadn't tried to say anything until this point, so I don't know. This is what gets us 3-star reviews on iTunes.
Oh my god.
All right, so the author has there's such a not only for the film, because he talks about how poorly put together the film is, how it lacks any real narrative. Like, I don't know, I don't want to project or assume because I don't know this guy, but listening to the disdain for something that really showcases a few people who had an experience where the movie culminates with a bunch of people who are harmed by Exodus International's ministry, quote unquote, talking to the president of it, and he realizes that, oh my God, we've hurt people. And like, this whole thing comes to a close because people, not everyone in it, but enough, they recognize that they've done damage, and the stories of those people resonate with them, which is, I think, also a beautiful thing to see, because that's why I changed my mind. That's why Casey changed. Like, we change our mind because of stories and personal interactions and hearing from these people who have experienced these awful things. And for him to just come out with such a disdain for, like, Exodus doesn't exist anymore. And what you see in this film is why. And he's so fucking angry about it in this article. And that's really telling to me that I feel like I don't know if this is okay to say, but I feel like he's just angry. He almost like it's like an internalized anger of that, because he can't admit that that's who he is too. I don't know. What do you think about that, Luke? Am I going too far with saying something like that? Or?
Of course there's an anger that's there, right? It's kind of like, well, they kind of allude to it in the film at one point where, one of the ex-leaders says that he saw his community at the time, which again, it wasn't his community at the time because he was actively vilifying those folks at the time. But now I'm assuming that, yes, he's part of the queer community at the time. Again, he was standing in sharp contrast to these people, even though, of course, he shared the orientations of a lot of them. And so he says that he saw the queer community. They had a vigil after Prop 8, and they were mourning over Prop 8. And he said that was this moment that he broke. And I think for a lot of folks who identify as ex-gay, it's always sort of one foot in the Christian world, one foot in the queer world, in a certain sense. And I don't mean to say that they're all living double lives. A lot of them are. As we saw we see that one of the leaders, of course, was living a double life, or at one point at least, he goes to this bar. Who knows what other interactions he had, although we do know that he had a porn history, and his wife found it, apparently before that. So, but putting that aside, it's like all queer people, or all these queer folks who are identifying as ex-gays, they have this one foot in, one foot in, one foot out kind of mentality. Again, for me, when I went to Rosedale Heights School of the Arts, I was this queer kid who was also identifying as this evangelical. And you better believe I was always like, whenever I heard about, some of the gay students, and there were a lot of gay students at Rosedale, talking about whatever, I perked ears because I wanted to hear, because of course that's who I am, right? Like that's who I, and
right.
Although I wouldn't have identified as such at the time, I obviously was in it, and obviously still am. And so I think that for a lot of these folks who are writing about films like Pray Away, who are ex-gays, who are held up as these poster children of, these like success stories, who have, denounced or renounced their former way of life and are now living as, new identities in Christ, however that might, however they might define their sexuality, I don't really know, other than that they're not living the gay life, and that they're not, they don't have the gay identity. Again, I think both are action-based descriptors. But I think for these folks, they see queers and they desperately want to be a part of that world. And I think about, I have one friend from conversion therapy at Liberty he messaged me a lot about a lot of the things I was posting and writing early on. And he even, we still like do FaceTime calls and talk, and we'd like debate theology and stuff. It was like really fruitful. I think we were both really convincing the other party of everything. But one part of it was that I thought was like so wild was at the end of it, he would always ask, "How's your partner?" And every time it was this like, you could see in his eyes this like unbelievable like desperation, wanting just to like jump across the screen, like live that for himself. And it was always this like the most human moment of it all. The moment that I thought was most convincing for him was when I would describe my relationship, and you could just tell that it was like this like deep longing and yearning. And so when you see this anger coming out in this article against, Hollywood and the people who were part of this film or whatever, it's this like sublimated anger that they have for themselves, because they can't just be themselves, and they hate themselves for who they simply are. And it's because, of course, they've been taught for so long that this is what it means to be a Christian, and what it means to take up your cross if, in fact, you like men or are attracted to men and are a man. And so what we see here, this anger, I think it's absolutely just like redirected energy that should be directed toward himself, because he's the jailer of his own prison. Right, he's keeping himself there, and I think he's angry, and understandably.
Like like even if they are, even if they could even potentially, it's like, it sounds like what you're saying is, and probably a lot do, is admit that it's difficult and that they're frustrated by it, but that is that's them denying themselves for Christ, and which in turn will prove true in eternity or something. Even Beckett writes something in the article about, oh, well, we'll see who's, almost like a we'll see who's laughing in eternity kind of statement. You're like, Jesus.
Oh, absolutely. That's what it's like. What terrible.
Yeah.
But that's which is like, eternity will show that those who choose to live according to God's beautiful purposes for sexuality, rather than taking pride in their own self-made sexual morality, however acceptable it becomes, are the ones on the real side of history. And it's like,
right?
Isn't that just the most? Whenever you stand back from, like, for me, like standing back from my time as a Christian and seeing that constant invocation of eternity, and like how we need to constantly be considering how like that's going to be better at this delayed gratification, like in eternity. When you look at that, you're just like, what a wildly successful and horrifying scare tactic, right? That keeps so many people under control and in the fold. And it's like,
absolutely,
dear God, like, could you imagine if like they didn't have that like, that wild card? If you could take that away from them, all of a sudden people would be like, nah, I'm good, actually. I'm going to live the life that I want to live, because who knows how long this life's actually going to be, like, it's just wild to see how actually historically effective and continuously effective that is, this idea of eternity.
Yeah. I
was curious to think, like, in the show, it's talking, it follows several different people, and it seems like there's almost like an arc that they all kind of followed on their way through all of this, their journey and stuff. Do you think that obviously there's outliers for sure, but do you think that a large percentage of people follow that same arc, where like eventually they realize that like they're putting everything they have into this mindset and this worldview that just, it's not bringing them happiness and it's not bringing them relief. And, it eventually, because how long can you live under that burden,
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you think as time goes on? Obviously, in 1950s America, it was a real statement to be openly gay. That there was a lot more serious ramifications for that socially outside of the church than there is now. Do you think that with the way that everything is trended now, where just the world in general is more open to homosexuality and different, other alternative lifestyles and stuff, do you think more people are going to follow that arc where they eventually come to a breaking point?
Yeah, I think that is so dang common for so many folks who were in conversion therapy, right? That there's this at first like almost exuberance and excitement to be there. You're all pumped because you're going to become straight, and and who knows how long. And you start reading all the work, the manuals, and you meet other ex-gays, and you're like doing your best not to like go on dates with them after, and learn their last names. You can creep them on Facebook, that kind of stuff. And so you're you're doing all this and you're excited. And then you get into the nitty gritty, and then you get into this like hard emotional work, because they use oftentimes a very like weird pseudo Freudian understanding of like of psychoanalysis, or just like how to like analyze someone or break down the reasons for, or like finding the root cause for their quote unquote same sex attraction. So you get into that work, and you're thinking back about your relationship with your mom and your dad, and you're like, oh, this is hard emotional work, but I'm doing it. I'm getting there. And then, the weeks go on, and the months go on, and you're like, nothing's really changing. But maybe sometimes I feel like I'm not all that attracted, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna ride with that. And then you keep going, and then you keep going, and you keep going, and then you're like, oh my gosh, nothing's changing. Nothing's changing. Oh my word, nothing's changing. This is really frustrating. God, what's going on? Why can't I change? God, where are you? What are you doing in this? What's going on? And it's this, then it turns into not just God, what's going on? What's happening here? Then it's like, if God is faithful, if God can do anything, if God again can create the world, and God can, perform miracles in, X, Y, and Z contexts, then God can do that with me too. So if God's not doing that, am I the problem? And that at first, those moments of guilt where you felt bad for what you had done because you slipped up or you made a quick little mistake, and then you got back on the horse and you're, doing on the straight and narrow, pun completely intended. And then, you do this once or twice, and then again, it keeps happening. That's when it turns to shame, right? It's no longer just feeling a sense of guilt, like I'm guilty for that one thing or that one action, but then it's like, no, it's actually me that's bad. It's not that there was a bad action here, there, and over there, but it's now that I'm the bad one. And then you start really friggin' hating yourself, right? There's this real strong sense of self-hatred, and then again, like the shame and the anxiety and all of this kind of compounds, to the point where you're like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. And you actually see that in the film. You see John Polk, he talks about how he's like, either I'm going to take my own life, or I'm going to go out and explore who I am. And so I think that that's what the film dramatizes for us, is that there is this pattern. And for me, it was the same thing. I went to Liberty. I was all excited. I got out of Liberty, and I was like, get me the hell out of this like weird upside down world called evangelicalism. And I separated from, that world. And again, my understanding of sexuality throughout that transition from liberty to still religious to not religious anymore maps onto how I exited conversion therapy as well, right? It's like the timeline's pretty comparable. And so I think for me, watching that and seeing all these people have similar experiences where like they are really adamant, then they kind of wane, and then they're like, I hate myself, and there's this really awful moment, whatever that moment might be. And each of the folks in the film, I think, have at least something that happens to them. That there's this moment where there's this like, oh my gosh, I need to get out of this. I think it's pretty comparable, and we see this, and that's why, again, Casey, when when Beckett Cook talks about how like poorly done the movie is and the narrative arc's like missing, I love that, because you're like, what? You completely missed that? Like you didn't see any of what we the world.
I know.
It's like it's like he's looking at it as if it was Christian propaganda, like how they would make it. It's like there's no definitive point they're trying to make here. It's just people's stories. Like they didn't edit them, doctor them. They didn't use them for anything.
Yeah.
This is garbage.
Where's the exploitation here for the narrative?
Right.
He says, come on. But the focus on McCall is an odd choice, and as we see later, seems like a story from another film that somehow got mixed up in the editing room and mistakenly attached to this one. Why his story is juxtaposed with the stories of former Exodus leaders is unclear. It's like, again, for someone who worked in Hollywood for decades.
He clearly emptied producers' trash cans in Hollywood. This guy didn't do shit.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, man, he's just at a different point in the arc. It's another trip around the wheel.
And I think like it's so clear what like McCall's role is, right? That it's like not an odd choice at all, as Beckett Cook says. He says, but it's like given how he's one of the current leaders of the ex-gay movement, which of course is terribly unsuccessful. It's like we're obviously bookending, this whole narrative about Exodus and the fall of Exodus with this guy to show this is where Exodus has led, right? Like these are the enduring consequences of Exodus today. It's showing what Exodus spawned. It's people like Jeffrey McCall and the sad stories of people like Jeffrey McCall, right? Like this is the enduring fruit.
Yeah. And
that's obviously why he's bookending and also, woven throughout the narrative.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that's interesting too about Exodus is, they continue. There are a lot of people who might have like come and gone throughout Exodus, and they might have not known which people, stuck with it or didn't. But one thing that it probably doesn't account for, and like people like Beckett definitely don't account for, is bisexuality, right? So like, what's the success rate for all your ex-gays? And is it similar to people who are bisexual? Like, I would like to know that, because it would make sense. Like if 10% of the LGBTQ community or whatever, 20, I don't know, whatever you want to say is bisexual, and you're longing for a monogamous relationship, and, and you factor in failed marriages, whatever that percentage is. Like if you really factor in all of that, I wouldn't be surprised if their success rate was pretty comparable to the bisexual community. And those people have just been convinced to some degree that because if you're a guy and you're attracted to men, or you're a woman and attracted to women, that you are gay, and that your attraction to your spouse or finding that person for you that could pull you out of that quote unquote gay lifestyle was God's gift or God's salvation, whatever it is. Really, it's just
that it works.
Yeah, really, it's just you are lucky, and I don't know, lucky seems like the wrong word to use, but lucky enough, I guess, in that community to have been bisexual, where you could, pass as a success story. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, like, first and foremost, obviously, to reiterate what everyone in the room hope, like, not in this room, I mean, like, in general. Sorry, I didn't mean like you, Casey, and Sam in this room.
Well, all right. Feel free to educate us.
No, like that everyone obviously, now that it's 2021, I would like to hope, I would hope to think that most people know that conversion therapy doesn't work. And of course, every single study, and I mean every single study, has not only confirmed that no, conversion therapy does not work, but it's also proven to be damaging, right? And in some, reports and some studies, it's even compared to and described as torture. So, of course, conversion therapy doesn't work. So that's the first premise that, of course, like this entire conversation has to be founded upon. From there, we talk about folks who are bisexual. Okay, so if you have someone who's bisexual and they go through conversion therapy, like, would it be considered a success story that they come out, quote unquote, straight? No, because they're still bisexual, right? They go in and go out the same. They will always be bisexual, or they will always be, I shouldn't say always in the sense that sexuality is not fluid. Some people's sexuality does change. And of course, that's something that Beckett Cook tries to bring up and says, like, the queer community, they say that people, their sexuality is fluid, yet they can't change. And it's like, no, the queer community is saying, what we're saying is not that you should change. We're just saying that sexuality is fluid, and, different interests or desires or likes or whatever, and orientations and, reorientations generate throughout one's life. And that's great. Who gives a shit? What we're saying is that you shouldn't force people to change, because, again, you can't force someone to change. You might change and whatever and grow in your sexuality or your gender identity expression, but it doesn't mean you should tell others to do that. So, of course, that's part of it too. So people who are bisexual going into conversion therapy come out, they're still bisexual. Or, again, however much sexuality changes or is fluid in the sense of, someone's sexuality naturally changing, or, whatever, or the fact that it's fluid. So there's that. But then I think this idea of bisexuality, it's like, of course, like you're saying, these are people who can be used as poster children for, for conversion therapy programs, because, again, they have attraction to both gender, sex, whatever, or maybe to multiple gender, sex, whatever. And they can claim that, of course, they were able to go in and change based on their desire to change, not simply just because, again, sexuality and gender are fluid. So I think that what happens here with bisexual folks is that they can be used in such a way, and that's what we see with Yvette Cantu, right? We see that she was bisexual, though she, in her public-facing talks, talked about being a lesbian and living the lesbian life for like 6 or some odd years or whatever. And so for her, again, that was right in the film, where you're like, wait, she's married to a man still, yet she's no longer a leader. What?
That threw me too.
Yeah. But of course, she's bisexual. And so I think that what she demonstrates is that you might be able to claim that this person is a success story. You might be able to, say demonstrably, like, this person, not really demonstrably, but like in some sense, like, arguably this person has changed. But for her, she's like, I don't think she would say she changed. I'd say that she just, blocked off or tried her best to block off her attraction to women. Again, I don't know what that's like to be bisexual. I don't know what that's like to be bisexual in a marriage. That never been my experience, so I don't fully know. But I think that what happens is that these people are used as poster children for the movement to again demonstrate that one can change one's orientation of gender identity expression.
So that's one of the more interesting paragraphs, I think, in this whole article, because he ends one by saying the message is clear. If you are denying your sexual desires in order to follow Christ, you are just fooling yourself. Those desires are what define your identity, and to tamper with who you really are is dangerous and delusional. And then he goes on to say, it's worth noting how this stance represents contradictory doublespeak from the LGBTQ movement, which on one hand insists that gay identity is utterly unchangeable, while on the other suggests sexuality and gender are fluid, and that radical self-expression demands we can change our identities on any given Tuesday. So the worst statement in this thing, turns out the LGBTQ movement actually is in favor of reparative therapy. It's just that the only trustworthy therapist is you. And I feel like this is such a willful misstatement of like modern views on sexuality and gender and stuff. And I don't know, I was trying to piece together like everything that was wrong with this statement, and it's hard to reason. There's so many pieces to it, but to say on the one, I mean, nobody's saying that your soul sexual, like your sexual desires. Well, okay, so that's first piece of it, right? Is that Christianity, like that hard right wing evangelical movement, constantly boils the gay community and sexuality and stuff like that down to just like sexual impulses.
Yeah.
And sexual acts oftentimes too, like you're disgusting because of sodomy. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
You don't know my sex life? Like, leave me alone.
Yeah, dude, it's funny when you say that, because this has come up a few times. And is that like a patriarchal, quote, like masculine culture of evangelicalism has a lot to do with why they focus a lot on gay men versus gay women or bisexuality. Like they would, if you ask them, they would say all are the same, all are equally the problem. But in their conversations and the way that it's talked about, so much of it is geared towards gay men. And that has a lot to do with when gay men express themselves in a way that evangelicalism has deemed unmasculine, which is the problem. That's like kind of scary for them. They're off put by that. They're uncomfortable by it for whatever reason. And I can't even say for whatever reason. It's conditioning to some degree, because at times in my life, I can recall being like, I don't know, that feels weird to, in pride, during a pride parade, to dress up or walk around in a rainbow colored underwear, whatever. Like you could just throw it all out. Like you what I have instilled in me is what masculinity is, as a teenager, as someone in college, was like, oh, that doesn't seem right. And I don't know. It's just, I just don't.
There's a lot there. Yeah, it's so conditioned into you from the get-go.
Yeah, and I think, to go back to what Becca Cook says, this idea that on the one hand, the gay community or the movement says that gay identity is utterly unchangeable. Hold up, he said, let me just read the exact quote. It's worth noting how this stance represents contradictory doublespeak from the LGBTQ movement, which on the one hand insists that gay identity is utterly unchangeable, while on the other suggests sexuality and gender are fluid, and that radical self-expression demands we can change our identities on any given Tuesday. So, like, it's such a poorly done straw man, right? Or woman, depending. It's this horrible, again, like, falsification.
Straw person! Jesus Christ!
Straw person, you're right. You're right! I take that correction in stride. But it's like, what we're saying is that indeed, like, he has part of it right, that sexuality and gender are fluid. Yep, that is what we're saying. We're just saying you shouldn't tell other people, to change theirs when they're expressing no desire to change. You can't force anyone to do that again, if someone, identifies as gay from a young age or whatever, and then slowly realizes, maybe I am more attracted in some ways to women or whatever, or, a woman feeling this, up, for men or whatever. If that were the case, it's like, cool. Like, no one's saying that's right or wrong. We're just saying, like, thumbs up, you do you. But what we're saying is, when you tell someone else, you have to change. You can't be what you define as, or what you describe yourself as, or the way you're attracted, whatever. You can't act on that. You have to try your best to do whatever you can do to find the other or another gender or sexuality, or whatever, attractive. That's what we're saying, is that you shouldn't and can't do that.
Right.
It doesn't work. But if, again, someone's sexuality is fluid and they have this like moment of self-discovery or moments of self-discovery throughout their life, and they're, exploring and whatever, cool, you do you. No one's saying that's bad. We're just saying, don't tell other people to do that. Like, that's not the vibe.
Yeah. It's like there's this mischaracterization, like he's intentionally mischaracterizing. And this is something that I missed for most of my life. And honestly, even after becoming an affirming person, it still took me a while to come to terms with this within the past couple of years. Not come to terms, I should say, but understand it properly. Is what, Casey? Fuck you.
I just read the chat.
Oh, yeah. Okay. We're going to leave this in. Casey starts laughing when I'm saying something serious. And I'm like, what did I say wrong? So, okay. This is what happens when you have video and nobody else gets to see it. Also part of the problem. Maybe we'll have video someday. Anyway, coming to terms with learning to understand, like, and understanding is like it as like Christianity or evangelical or non-affirming Christianity will be like, they like to celebrate the gay. I don't celebrate being straight. It's like, dude, they're not, I mean, at some level, they're just celebrating like they've been oppressed for so long. And now we live in a time, and even before we even lived in that time, there were brave people celebrating it. And it's because it's been oppressed for so long. Like, and it's okay to celebrate that. And I don't know. It's like, it's so simple. And I feel like it took me a little while to get like, because like what you're saying, Luke, like, oh, whatever your sexuality is, if it changes, if it doesn't, great, good for you. But the straight narrative has been dominant and it's been oppressive, and I should say the straight agenda. I'm sorry. And when you see gay people and people in the LGBTQ community celebrating that, it's like kind of just like we are proud of who we are, despite the oppression we've gone through. Go fuck yourself. And that's great. And it's beautiful and it should happen. And I think they're reading into it something that's just not even there. And that's not something that's not happening. It's weird.
Well, on top of that too, though, I think that there is a celebration of sexuality, whatever the heck it is. If we think about a wedding, what exactly is a wedding other than like, the idea of like, we're making our vows before God? Like, no one cares. But, like, everyone's doing it for that big party. They're doing it for that big celebration, and it should be celebrated. You'll have an old, woman or an old man walking down the street, and they'll be holding hands, and someone will look at them and say, "Oh, isn't that just adorable, that old couple?" They're celebrating that person's expression of sexuality in some way, shape, or form, right? Like, and so I think that for us too, it's like, by and large, like, historically what's been the case when two queers are walking down the street and holding hands is that they've been, scoffed at or made to
hit with rocks.
Precisely. One of those old-fashioned tactics. And so it's like, what happens there is that we're saying, in the same way that you celebrate, straight people's lives, and there's stuff to celebrate, like, whatever, like a wedding, again, like seeing a couple hold hands or whatever, especially an old couple for whatever reason, that's apparently really cute, but it is. And it's like,
I don't like seeing a lot of straight people hold hands.
Sam, are you one especially about the old folks? You're just against seeing the old folks hold hands? Is that what you just said?
Oh no, what I heard you saying about old folks is that following Pride Month we need Geriatric Love Month. Is that what you were saying?
Precisely my point.
I try to be open-minded, but I do hate old people. I mean, I'll just state that on the record.
But you know what I mean? Like, so there is a celebration, and I think that there's nothing wrong with that. And yeah, there is also the part of it where it's like, yeah, we haven't been able to do this in the same way that straight people have been able to, express their sexuality in public. It is something new. But then I think there's also even part of it too, where it's always seen as a spectacle, right? So gay pride is so wonderful, and it's great because we have this idea that we're actually able to publicly express it in the sense that we're not seen as weird when we do it because we're all together, and there are allies and whatnot there as well. But like then there's also the part of it where it's like you have maybe there's an affirming person. She works at I don't know, Sears, and there's a gay couple who comes in and they're looking at some cute linens for their bed or some cutlery or home decor, whatever, putzing around some department. As queer
charcuterie boards, maybe.
Yeah, maybe we're in the garden section. I don't know. That's quite fitting, I think. But you know what I mean? Something along those lines. And the affirming person sees this queer couple and says, "Oh, isn't that cute?" And it's cute in a lot of ways. Most oftentimes, for the sole fact that it's like, "Oh, look at that gay couple. They're actually comfortable enough to do that." And it's like I think that what straight people have in their day-to-day life is sometimes that when there's a casual hug, or the person interlocks their fingers with their partner, or they put their arm around their partner in public, people oftentimes don't think twice when they see that. Again, if it's an old couple, again, there's some novelty there. But if you put them aside, there's this sense of invisibility in public. And I think for queer people, there isn't that. Even when it's affirming, they're still noticed, right? It's like the Treasurer's cat, his name's Cat, it changes based on being observed, whereas that invisibility that straight people have,
Schrodinger? Was it Schrodinger?
Yeah.
Schrodinger's cat.
Scrotumer's cat.
All of a sudden, Luke's very interested.
Yeah. What cool cat are you talking about? No, but I think that's part of it too. Like, there's I don't know. That's maybe perhaps tangential and not necessarily related to exactly what we're saying, but I think there is something to be said about being a spectator or being a spectacle or being whatever, and pride and celebration, blah blah blah. I think it all kind of connects.
I think it's all a part of it's like all a part of taking apart this like poison mindset that you get taught as a kid in the church, and I mean, I just, a lot of this stuff I look back on myself, and because I mean, I was for sure homophobic, like for a large portion of my life. It was just, that was the reality in the community that I grew up in and stuff. And there's, all of my friends that have moved on and since, and even some who are still Christians, like that's something that we've talked about, is just like the, feeling embarrassed about like these just simple views of things that you held so close, and you were willing to like speak out or do ugly things in service to those simple views that really don't hold up, once you put them under the light. And I think a lot of this stuff ties back to that, where it's like just getting people who grew up in those communities and stuff to realize that like sexuality isn't all just about sex acts. This is not just all about who you have physical affection with and stuff like that. It's about, your identity as a whole, like something deeper than that. And I don't know. I don't really know how to express it, but I think it's like an important thing to hit on, is like you start to take apart those viewpoints when you see the contradictory notions like personified. When like homosexuality is personified, you meet gay people and you understand, and you start to realize like, these people are living fulfilling lives and they're not out to destroy my faith and all of this kind of stuff. Like that's the kind of stuff that really makes a change. It's never a pitch from a cable news channel or something like that gets people to reconsider these things. It's when they hear and see how it affects real people. And I think that's part of what's important about stuff like this documentary, is just that you get to see the effect that those pressures and influence and stuff put on regular people, and just how unhappy it made them, and how freeing it was to finally be forward and open about who they were. And that's a big thing that the church, at least in my experience, my church, that's a part that like you're never going to get to do. Like to express the idea that like, even to, the idea that's being sold here in this like response article, that you're not free from homosexual desires. You're still a person who has homosexual desires. You're learning how to deny those in Christ. You couldn't say that in my church. You know,
Hmm.
you certainly couldn't say that and then, volunteer with the youth group. Like that's never going to work. You're never going to be accepted as a person who is, coping with their homosexual desires. You're only going to be accepted as a person who's free of those now. You've moved on, you're free through Christ, and all of that is behind you. And because of that, we'll let you be a part of the community. But, we can't have gay men who are repressing their desires as a part of they have to deny that reality in order to handle the fact that there are people with different identities and lifestyles and stuff within their midst.
That makes me think of two things, Casey. One, it's just wild to see the effects of bad theory, and of course theology after all is theory, how the theology based on 6 verses within the the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, how such small verses and such poor theology can have such a dramatic and horrible consequences on the lives of so many people, right? Like based on this difference in sexual orientation, and again, this really horrible, poor, destructive, death-dealing theology can have on people simply for the fact that they're attracted to, and the same sex or the same gender, and that their Bible tells them that that's wrong, or again, their interpretation of their Bible tells them that's wrong, and how people are so willing to blindly adhere to such nonsense, such hate-filled beliefs, simply because they're told the Bible, quote unquote, says that, whatever the hell that means. Like, the Bible says that. What does it mean for the Bible just to say that? Again, we all come with our interpretations. And it's just wild to me that you see the consequences of this blind adherence to a really bad theology, and how many people are willing to fall victim to that, and and then believe it, and then treat people in the way that they do. And you see the consequences, right? Like, there are so many youth suicides within church, right? You see there are so many, so much self-hatred. There's so much awful baggage that comes with this. And it's based on, again, a blind adherence to some really poorly interpreted and theologized verses that, again, when the documentary 1946 comes out, will hopefully blow the minds of many evangelicals, though I'm a little bit doubtful that it will. But all that to say is, it's just these few verses. Yeah, I'm not really, holding out for a revolution within the evangelical church. What can I say? And actually, that even the idea that kind of side long comment I make there about not having hope, I think that before I had said that conversion therapy, the thing about conversion therapy is that there are more and more people leaving the evangelical spaces, so there are fewer and fewer people involved. True, but I think the other side to that, and I think that the reason why the film ends the way that it does, on this bleak note of ending with the saddest figure of the entire film, Jeffrey McCall, because of course he's still holding out hope that he's going to have a great life. It's just so wild to see how that film ends, because I think it is also painting a very accurate picture as well, that it is a bleak outlook, because even with the fall of Exodus, even with these organizations, declining in numbers, there still are people like Jeffrey McCall, and there will arguably always be people like Jeffrey McCall who are desperate to get out of who they are in order to fit into a community, which is all this to say that's the first point. And I'll really quickly end on the second point, is that the second point is the power of community, right? Seeing how powerful a community can be to take someone to such an extreme and to do the things that we see in the film. For people to do what they are doing, it is speaking to the unbelievable influence of how moral communities shape, guide, and control in a lot of ways who we are and how we are able to self-identify and ultimately live as authentic individuals or not. And I think that what you see even when Jeffrey McCall is being introduced at the front of the church, right? There are these Theo bros and these pastors or whatever wearing these tight shirts saying this is Jeffrey, he's our brother in Christ, we love him. And then Jeffrey's standing there and starts crying. In what world would a person who's emotionally stable start just sobbing over someone saying something nice about them, hey, we want the best for you, we think you're great? They weren't really saying anything. They were all that really cutting to the bone.
That's bleak.
But you know what I mean? This guy starts crying when they're saying we love you, man, and he's overcome with emotion, right? Seeing how unstable this man is, and seeing how unwell this man is because of his desperate need to be accepted by this community. And of course, they will only accept him, like you were saying, Casey, if he continues in this, what I would call a lifestyle, which again, I wouldn't call being gay a lifestyle. Again, I don't know what that even means, but this is a lifestyle where you're constantly rejecting who you are. That's a way of life.
Yeah.
Really, again, death dealing. And it's something that I think is something to highlight when watching this film, is how incredibly sad the character, who's not a character, of course, a real person, Jeffrey McCall, how sad this man is.
Yeah.
And you see another, the woman, the bisexual, oh my God, I'm blanking on her name.
I think before she married her name.
Yeah.
Yes.
But at the end, it shows her watching that YouTube video of a guy, an ex-gay man who's now in a monogamous straight marriage, giving his quote unquote testimony. And when you see him breaking down, talking about how, and then God gave, it's like all, and look, and this might be Beckett's problem, is he would watch that video in a vacuum and be like, he is overcome with emotion about the way God transformed his life. But when you watch it, especially after watching the documentary, you think, oh my God, like this guy's melting down. He's not crying tears of joy because God changed his life. He is just devastated that this is his reality. But he is repressing it.
Wasn't he describing when he saw his wife at the altar, like when she started walking down the aisle, and that's when he starts crying? Like, yeah, I probably would too, because that's the beginning of a sentence, of a life sentence to something that I wouldn't want to do. And that's exactly what that was for this man. This man did not want to get married. None of these ex-gay, quote unquote, individuals want to get married. There are so many friends that I have. I shouldn't say so many, like as if they're like dozens and dozens, but I have a handful of friends from Liberty specifically who went through conversion therapy. And these men are all married to women, and listening to and watching their lives unfold on Instagram has been awful. I feel so incredibly, and I mean sincerely, bad for these men who they go and they live lives of inauthenticity. I have one friend who apparently, the rumor has it that he's been caught on Grindr multiple times and his wife still is with him. And it's like, of course this man's going outside of marriage for whatever, because again, he didn't want to be in this marriage in the first place. And again, I'm not in any way condoning what he's done. I think it's all horrible. What I'm saying is, like, it's understandable, not justifiable, but it's understandable. And I think for these folks who,
and sad for his wife too.
Of course. And I think
like that she's still in a world where she has to convince herself that her husband's not actually gay and this is just a slip up. And like, that's not health. I don't know. I don't want to say as emotionally damaging, because I don't want to compare like the struggles of a straight person in general with the struggles of a gay person. But in a situation like that, that is so wildly unhealthy and emotionally damaging for both of them now that they've committed to something that's not true.
And she's bound to that commitment that she made because she thinks that she's going to be in some way God's hands in this, that God's going to use her in an eternal way. And she's therefore I need to be here.
Right.
This is my cross to bear, pardon me, not to bury. She's bearing it, not bearing.
Don't bury him. Don't bury him, please.
Don't bury the treasure. Don't bury the cross. Jesus is risen. And so I think that what we see here, what I've seen with these women and seeing their lives, of course, unfold as well, is like, you of course think behind the scenes, like, what must it be like to have, again, honestly, I wouldn't even say make love, but I'd say to have sex in a more crude way, because I think it is a more crude act. I don't think there's much, again, like physical, or there's much eros, involved. But what must it be like to have sex with someone who doesn't want to have sex with you? What must it be like to be with someone and know that deep down, and they know as well as everyone does, just as much as their husbands do and everyone around them, that it's not a fit or fair marriage for either of them, right? And so I think it must be just terrible to day in and day out be with the person who you've chosen to be with, who doesn't want to be with you in the same way you want to be with him or her, depending on the dynamic.
Terrible. I feel like it's a topic that you could write a whole book on, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, do you know if there's anybody who's done like a book or any real comprehensive work on examining like how big of an impact the AIDS crisis had on anti-gay propaganda and movement and stuff, because that was something that I noticed Yvette, right? That was a part of her pitch when she was, still with the anti-gay movement and stuff. And it was, I had 15 male friends in the gay community that died as a result of AIDS. And like, we know that the church capitalized, this hard right-wing version of the church capitalized on the idea that like AIDS is a scourge, it's a punishment inflicted by God on sinners and stuff. And that has to be a huge part of why we're still talking about this, why it's still at the level of social acceptance that it is now. It's just like the damage done during the AIDS crisis and using that as a propaganda tool.
Yeah, so I can show you this, but of course listeners can't see it. This is an ad from the religious right. This was the Moral Majority Report, July 1983, and I'll describe it, but I'll show you guys. It's this picture of a family all wearing masks, and it looks almost like it's like a 1980s version of like a COVID family all wearing masks. But like nuclear family, father, mother, 2 kids, 1 boy, 1 girl. They're all taking a family portrait, and they all have masks on. And it says AIDS in all caps. Homosexual diseases threaten American families. So, speaking about AIDS and speaking about how, of course, AIDS impacted the ex-gay movement and the popularization of the ex-gay movement, I think that it's something that wasn't discussed in detail, though, like you said, Yvette does bring this up in the film. I think it's something that probably should have been emphasized a wee bit more. As for scholars working on this, I think that Chris Babbitts, he's a scholar to be looking out for. He has a forthcoming book called To Cure a Sinful Nation, I believe. It's by University of Chicago Press. I think it's coming out this year or next. I don't actually know. But in this book, it's this history of conversion therapy in America. And so I'm assuming that he's going to be bringing this up. But thinking about AIDS, of course, like you think about the rise of Exodus. I think, if I'm correct, it started in 1976. Michael Bussey, I think, leaves in 1979. These are rough estimates, but again, I'm pretty sure this is tracking. After that, of course, it starts expanding into the 80s, up into the 90s, and then the early 2000s. Right, this is the peak of it, all in this kind of time, and it's being popularized and legitimized by Nicolosi and the ridiculous pseudoscience that he's publishing. He's that like guy who you see interrogating the young kids, saying like. He's like essentially saying, like, what does he say? He's like, it's terrible being gay, huh? Like, it must, you're ashamed of yourself, huh? And the kid's just like, yeah. Or the man saying that, he's like, you feel broken. What is it like to feel broken and sitting here in front of me? Hurtful, sad, like that guy. So of course, this is when this guy becomes popular too, and around this era. But if we're thinking historically, like you are, Casey, and we're thinking about the AIDS epidemic, of course, the AIDS epidemic, in the 80s was when it was at its peak. And then in the 90s, of course, in the 90s, they find, a treatment for it. But up until, what was it, 1995 or so, before the treatment, of course, the AIDS epidemic was horrifying. This is where, literally millions of people across the world are dying, and no one knows really exactly what's going on, right? And the FDA and the American government writ large, we're saying nothing, we're doing nothing. Reagan doesn't utter the word AIDS for, who knows how long, right? And so we have this epidemic where people are just dying. And like Yvette says, she's like, I have like X number of my friends who just are dead, simply from, well, we don't really know, AIDS, whatever the hell that is and what it's doing to our community. So when you have this horror surrounding you with a government that's doing nothing and no one is able to protect themselves, no one is able to, again, like safeguard themselves against this, other than, again, they figured out like protection, like using condoms was a way to prevent this. Again, not a 100% bet that even by using condoms, you're not going to contract this, right? Because condoms sometimes break. And so all of this happening, right? This bloodbath, of course you're going to want, or your desire to live according to a heteronormative model is amplified, because not only is it not socially acceptable, now it's seen as, by a lot of people, a death sentence. So AIDS, of course, and HIV/AIDS was this epidemic that drastically influenced the popularity, or at least the desire, quote unquote, and of course the word desire is complicated in this sense, to become a member of Exodus or to try to change. Again, do we really desire to do that? No, we don't really desire to do that. We're told we desire that. But again, agency is a difficult question in evangelicalism, and like, how do we define what it means to be a free agent or a free thinker within this really bizarre upside down world of evangelicalism? But all this to say, I think HIV/AIDS was, of course, a big driving factor, though I don't know if it was given enough tension in the film or if there was necessarily room for that, given the breadth of the film.
That was definitely a part of the pitch made to me. 'Cause I have a family member that was gay and died of AIDS, and I just I think about like how that was such a big part of what was the stated position on it, like the anti-gay and homophobic vitriol. Part of it was like this avenging this death in the family is a part of it, and I don't know, I don't. Yeah, it's a big subject. We can move on, but that's wild. You mentioned another documentary that's coming out. What was that about?
Yeah, 1946. So 1946 was, again, if I remember correctly, when there was a group of straight white men. They got together and they were making a new translation of the Bible. And part of this translation, there was this seminary student who wrote to them and said, I've been following what you guys are doing, and I saw that you guys translated this term, homosexuality, incorrectly. And I don't think that the word's actually homosexuality. The fine folks who were doing this editing, translation, whatever, wrote back and or like kindly dismissed him. But the whole documentary is looking at the consequences of this mistranslation, how it's been used as a weapon. And the kid, I shouldn't say kid, he was a seminary student. The seminary student, when he says this, he says, I fear that if you keep this word translated as homosexuality or homosexual, that it's going to be used as a weapon. And of course, that's what we've seen. And so the documentarians are looking back. They actually go and find this guy who wrote this letter, and they talk to him, but they're talking about the mistranslation. And they're really, it's like a more popular, it's like a public-facing popular approach to re-understanding or going back and revisiting, should I say, those verses that have been used or proof text against the queer community. And understanding, if I understand correctly, the premise of the documentary, they're going back and actually thinking about what these words would have been or should have been or could have been if they were, quote unquote, properly translated.
If King James didn't write that angry letter, I don't want to hear it. Washing my hands.
So I think, Luke, to close us out here, I want to take a look at the, the closing comment from Beckett here in his article in regards to the film, and then kind of hear, because one of the things that the film does, to be clear for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, is Beckett takes a very strong stance that it's very dismissive of Christianity and hateful towards Christianity and essentially a fucking persecution film. And that couldn't be farther from the truth, because plenty of the people I don't know if it's plenty, some of them don't get into it specifically, but at least one of the couples in that is Christian. At least one of them is, and they get married in a church. And, it doesn't shit on Christianity at all. It deals with one issue, the failure of Exodus International, the damage that it did to people, the damage that the president of it admitted that it did to people, and then the stories of people who suffered the harm. So some of them are still Christians, practicing, got married in a church, and want to correct the ship here. But what he does, so Beckett's closing statement, I'm just going to read the last paragraph. It's a little long, but I think it's worth, just because it's kind of summarizes most of what we've talked about, which is what he's talked about, which is what the film's about. So he says, eternity will show that those who choose to live according to God's beautiful purposes for sexuality, rather than taking pride in their own self-made sexual morality, however acceptable it becomes, are the ones on the real right side of history. My plea to those in the LGBTQ community is to realize this before it's too late. Not to pray away the gay, but to pray away our pride and repent. The treasure of eternal life with Jesus is worth the struggle of living a wisp of time here with longings unresolved and desires. And so I have a quick comment to make about that, and then you guys can kind of say your piece too. But so coming from a perspective that still participates in a Christian tradition is like, I think even in my more conservative days, I would have had a real problem with that statement. He makes some really jarring conclusions that summarize the gospel into a right way of living. And this is the most clear cut example. And Christians have been doing this for a long time is, look, you could be gluttonous. You could be prideful. You could be really anything. But if you're gay, you're fucked. And I remember speaking to that, people kind of having those conversations with people and saying things like, well, yeah, because if you're living that lifestyle, you haven't repented. But that comes with the hubris of assuming you're, as a person, repenting of all your sin. And if you look at human history and how fucked up it is, everyone in it always thinks they're doing the right thing. So one of the things that I really felt, even when I was still convinced that, it was wrong to be gay or that you could do something about it or deny those desires, was I don't recall making a lot of heavy conclusions about how if you fall into that or you haven't quote unquote repented of it, that it's over for you eternally speaking. And for him to conclude his article with that, I think is so, it comes with such a hubris. It comes with such like a arrogance of I'm doing everything right. Like, and he can't, it's like, he talks about missing the forest through the trees at the beginning of that article. Fuck that. That guy cannot see his arrogance right in front of his face. He proofread that article multiple times. It went through editors and they were like, we're going to sign off on this because it's truth.
It's also a threat, right? Like he's threatening people. If you don't do this now, well, I won't see you in hell because I won't be there. Like, but you will.
Yeah.
I was just saying, like, this guy looks like he's he's in shape. Most pastors that are going to preach this all fiery from the pulpit are doing it like while chorging a donut. Yeah, this is like homosexuality is the one sin that will keep you out of heaven. That and suicide and maybe abortion too. Depends on how good your repentance story is for that,
and how much they can market it.
Whatever that means, we don't really know.
Yeah.
It was always the enigmatic way. Like, what does that mean?
I do have one more question for you, Luke. We see how harmful some of the stated values of the Christian community are. Do you, like me, think that Sam is a part of the problem for continuing to be a part of this harmful community? And is it time for him to leave and embrace Satan?
I think there are other problems with Sam that we need not get into right now.
I want to get into them.
But again, I'm not going to cast the first stone. Like, what a passive aggressive way. But I'm not going to get into detail. No. Well,
put it in the chat and I'll cast it.
Type away, cast away. Call me Tom Hanks. No, I think that this is. I've been thinking about this a lot recently, going back and forth, like about this idea of like this is good. There's good Christianity and there's bad Christianity, but of course, like being the arbiter of what's good and what's bad. That's of course a form of like authority. That it's like who gave you that authority, right? And like I just think about Christianity, and again, there has been so much harm that's been done in the name of Christianity. There has also been, a lot of good done in the name of Christianity. And I don't mean like the church who goes out and like washes cars and then prays for people afterwards. And like, we don't want you to do anything, but in reality, we really just want you to come to our church and like give us money and like also be part of the community and never like, and profess, your faith in Jesus and then, live eternity with me. Like there's all this like this extra added to it. But I do think there are moments of historical.
Yeah. All the padding.
Yeah. There are historical moments where Christianity has like, been like, whoa, how that is phenomenal. I'm thinking about like my main focus is that I study the Holocaust. Or my main focus is the Holocaust. And there's this small town called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, this little small French town, this Protestant town in France that during the Holocaust accepted, thousands of Jewish children as well as some adults. And they simply were just like, well, it was what we should do. Like that was it. And then after the Holocaust, the war ended. Off, these folks went who were in hiding, and some of them never saw them again. That was just there. And then that was kind of like they just went on with their lives. And it's like, what the heck do you do with that? Like that altruism, where is that coming from? What the heck is that? So there are moments of historical good from Christianity. But then again, what we see now, and Sam, you were saying this isn't an attack against Christianity. No, I don't think it's an attack against Christianity writ large. I think it's an attack against the toxic Christianity that has no longer been on the outskirts of, or on the periphery, but instead this is now mainstream evangelicalism. What we're seeing here, the death-dealing theologies of sexuality that are presented in this film that seemingly have gone defunct in a mainstream way, have not, because they're still alive and well within a lot of churches. And that's what we see, even with those guys who like welcome Jeffrey to their church. It's like a church that's saying, we agree with what you're saying. We agree with your theology of sexuality, right? It's an endorsement of it. And so I see this film as a critique of a lot of the majority, the vast, vast, vast majority of evangelicalism, because this is what the vast, vast, vast majority of evangelicalism is. And so I don't think that,
yes.
Again, I think that you can have again, maybe there's something there's something you want to salvage within your faith. And if that's the case, do it. Be awesome at it. Like, do good. Like, was it like Micah 3:8 or like walk humbly? I don't even know how long haven't read my Bible. Something else, and love justice or something like that, right? Like, cool, do it, phenomenal, right? But what I notice is that a lot of the time it's not the case. And my whole closing point for this is, I wonder, and I really do, this is like wondering, what would the evangelical church look like today if they took such a hard stance against greed in this?
Yeah, Jesus.
Right? Like, what would the church look like if they were like, we think capitalism is evil. We think that the corporations, taking advantage of whomever, whatever, or, people who are in the top 1% who control the remaining 99, like, what would the evangelical church look like if they took such a hard stance against greed or, whatever, capitalism, as they have taken against homosexuality, as they have taken against the queer community? Right? Like, how much more good could they have done?
And traditionally, I feel like there's a lot of Christian groups that have taken they've pointed their angst at issues that were actually valid and made sense and made life better for a lot of people. And I think that they could be that again. Obviously, I don't care. I'm not in it, but Sam you could take it in that direction. But like there's so many other places that you could direct your money and your focus and your time and your energy in the world that everybody would look at and say, wow, that's great. That's great work that they're doing against human trafficking or domestic violence or opioid addiction, whatever. Take an interest in an issue that makes life better for some people instead of just fiercely defending these social issues that are out of touch with reality, that aren't gaining you social capital, and that actually hurt people on the ground. And I feel
outside of your church, let's be clear about that too. Like, take care of people. Like, it's become insulated. Take care of people outside of your church if you want to look like the person you say you. I think that's
what do they call that? What's the word for that? Testimony.
But that's exactly it, right? Like, and greed, one example, like you're saying, Casey. We could talk about again, like domestic abuse. We could talk about sex trafficking. We could talk about racism. We could talk about environmental justice. We can talk about whatever. And it's like, if only they had have like directed their energies and attention and hatred, because I think, and like anger and rage, and I think there can be a productive use of anger and rage. If only they had have redirected all of that towards something that would have made sense or that was actually like worth directing. And as Yvette says in the documentary, she's like, we need quote unquote social issues. And again, the idea of being gay as an issue, I don't really think it's an issue, but again, they've made it an issue. They need these groups of people to hate in order to mobilize their constituencies, right? To vote, to give them money, whatever. And so, like, what if they had just done something initially that would have been like, again, life-giving, and where they would be, how they would be seen, right? Would also be like a really big, like, I don't know, a draw for them to have done the right thing. And like, because then people would be like, oh, look at those Christians, they're really doing stuff. Maybe we should like look into their Jesus. Again, that's what they're doing in a lot of ways. And that's why they do what they do half the time, because they want good optics or good PR. But like that, if you want to talk about good PR, do that. Not now, where we see people like fighting against like mask mandates and critical race theory being in schools. And it's like, you're just fighting literally anything that's against the main narrative because you think it's somehow like of the world or a culture, because culture is a bad word in evangelicalism somehow. But it's like, what if you actually just had been decent? Maybe if you were decent, there wouldn't be films like, Pray Away. There wouldn't be critiques of you because, well, we'd have nothing but the good things to say. Have we thought about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective to have on all that. I wish we could find that a little bit more in this event. You said one of the things is like, we wouldn't really have the quote unquote evangelical culture if that's the mindset they had, right? Or it would look different. You would have, I guess. But evangelicalism has been turned into a culture because that wasn't a super common term. Like everyone knew it, but it's really been, that word's changed a lot and really solidified what that culture is over the past like 6 years or so. And that word could have just continued to fly under the radar, but used internally occasionally and missed a lot if it wasn't, if they did take a different direction, like you said. But I don't know, Luke, I think that's probably a good place to conclude this. We've taken up a lot of your time. I know you have a lovely dinner to get to. So
you are officially our most frequent guest.
You're
like an honorary co-host.
I'm also official
friend of the show,
fan, if I do say so myself. So literally, like everything you guys do, every time I see like a post come up about who you've interviewed, I'm like, oh gosh darn it, like you guys, like at it again. Like everything you do. We love it. We love it up here. So keep it up. And it's an honor, a true honor and privilege to be on this show.
Luke Slam Dunk Wilson on Instagram.
Luke Slam Dunk Wilson on Instagram. And on Twitter, I think it's at Wilson_F as in Frederick, W as in Wilson.
And you've been on a couple of different podcasts here recently, some heavy hitters in this community. What are some episodes that people can find you on?
I was on Gangster Capitalism. I believe it was episode 7. I was on In God We Trust. I believe that was episode 8. Not that I've looked at this once or twice on my CV. But what else? I was on Fundy Fridays. It was like 3 or 4 weeks ago. I think I was on there. They're a
great show.
But
and recently, I think Straight White American Jesus.
Well, if you're listening at home, go take a listen to some of those other podcasts. Follow Luke on Instagram and Twitter and things like that. And we will talk to you next time.